Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about radical architecture of the future. Today on the show, I'm joined by the curator, critic, writer, and editor, Beatrice Galilee. Beatrice is currently the founder and executive director of The World Around, an itinerant conference and platform for architecture and cultural discourse. Before this, she was the first curator of contemporary architecture and design at the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York. She's curated shows around the world and has written for publications like Eflux, Domus, and Pinup. And from 2006 to 2009, she was the architecture editor for Icon magazine. I've been a fan of Beatrice's for a long time, but when her first book came out late last year, I knew I needed to get her on the show. The book is called Radical Architecture of the Future, and it's this look at the practitioners, critics, theorists, writers, artists, designers who are rethinking what architecture is and can be. It read in many ways like a list of all of my dream guests for this show, and forced me to reconsider my own thinking around contemporary architecture and design. And so we begin this conversation talking about the book. We talk about what radical architecture means, her own evolving definitions of architecture, and how the people in this book who span filmmaking, design, writing, sculpture, in addition to architecture, how all of them influence her own work. From there, we talk about her current project, The World Around, and her goals for this platform and how it differs from the work that she was doing at the Met. And then we close the conversation talking about curatorial practice and how her experience as an editor and a writer shapes this work. As you'll see, Beatrice thinks about her work in a way that I very much relate to, and it was so nice to talk through these ideas with her. If you like Scratching the Surface, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for superfans that give you access to all sorts of bonus content like a monthly newsletter, early episodes, full transcripts, and exclusive bonus interviews, all while helping to financially support this show. If you like Scratching the Surface, if you want to see it continue, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. It really helps keep the show going. You can visit patreon.com/surface podcast for all the details and to sign up. Thanks for listening, and here is my conversation with Beatrice Galilee. You have this new book or newish book, I guess, at this point, called Radical Architecture of the Future, which I loved for multiple reasons. The first being that it felt like just a great list of all the people that I should have on the show. You made my research very, very easy. But the other thing that I loved about it is that it's hard for me to say what I was expecting with a title like Radical Architecture of the Future, but what the book was not what I was expecting. And the reason being, I was really surprised and delighted by how many non-architects, maybe we could say, or people who are outside of kind of what we traditionally think of as architecture were featured in the book. And it all really made sense. And I think you kind of then created a really interesting thesis because of that. But it got me thinking about your own definitions of architecture and this kind of blurriness of what we now define as architecture. And I'm wondering, to start the conversation, if you can kind of talk about, in the context of putting this book together, how you thought about what architecture is and how you think about what architecture is.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much. I think for me, I studied architecture. I was an undergraduate architecture student, and my training as an architect kind of began with a very expanded idea of what architecture could be, because I didn't think I was going to be an architect. I was like someone who thought that I was interested in architecture, and I thought that was enough to study it. And what I was interested in architecture was that I was interested in people and sociology, and I was interested in like maths and engineering, and I was interested in history and cities. And I kind of went into architecture school with a very sort of sideways look at architecture. And my professors, one of my professors is actually in the book, Indy Johar.
Oh, yeah.
somehow I just sort of landed in this pretty conservative architecture school that was very, very open to this expanded field of architecture and wanted to encourage people to think about architecture as something else. And so, even though I was an architecture student, I wrote a magazine instead of designing a building for one of my final projects.
Yeah.
I did all of my professional practice inside an architecture newspaper in London. Um, and, we were very much understanding like the process of building and making and changing as something that an architect was kind of at best halfways involved in, like that there would always be an agent of change, which would be finance or a social need, or there's always an ask before there's an answer. And I think that kind of question and answer paradigm is something I always try to understand with architecture. Like, what's missing? Why do you need
Right.
an
Right.
architect? What's the problem that you're trying to solve, and how did that problem occur if you're trying to solve it? So there's always been, to me, this like huge iceberg underneath
Yeah. Yeah.
the ocean that we don't really talk about in architecture. And that's been my interest since, really, like since I first sort of came across the field as a very young person. So um, and also, I would say that I came across the field as someone who was planning to be a music journalist. So I
Oh,
was like
interesting.
really interested in like writing, and I was thought I would go into, and I did do a little bit of music journalism and writing for magazines and reviewing bands and stuff like that. So I was really interested in writing and thinking about, culture in a way, and arts and music, and ended
Mm,
up writing about architecture. So it's a little bit long-winded, but to me, it's not it's I understand that it is unconventional, let's say, to include game designers or
right.
artists who are working with spaces. But to me, they're just different answers to the same questions. There are different ways of exploring society and different ways of reflecting the values and the status of things now. And that's
Right.
what I find interesting about architecture. Like, what does it embody, and what is it? Yeah, a little bit like what we were saying that Deanna Van Buren says, is like we build our values, and
Right.
I think that really hits on how I see architecture, but also how I see all the disciplines around architecture. Um, so yeah,
Uh,
that's kind of a long answer.
yeah. No, I mean, that's you. I have many questions based on on that answer. Now, I'm. I mean, just for a second to keep it on the book, and then I would like to go back up to a few things you said about your education. But I would love to hear your a little bit about your kind of curatorial process for a book like this,
Hmm.
where it is ostensibly about architecture, and obviously we're talking about architecture in a very wide sense, but
Hmm.
then thinking of putting people like, and you started to say this, but I loved that someone like Elizabeth Diller could sit next to Arthur Jaffa,
Yeah.
or James Bridle, people who I don't
Hmm.
normally think of as even kind of remotely close to their work as architecture, but uh, the way you kind of curated this, the way you edited this, the way you put all of these people together, they all start to be in dialogue with each other. Can you talk a little bit about that process and how you started to go outside these kind of usual suspects that would go in a book about, quote unquote, radical architecture?
Yeah, definitely the way that I see it is that there are uh, like I guess I personally would find a book just about architecture like it would really not represent the discipline well, because I feel
Mm,
that the thing about architecture is that it absorbs life, it absorbs society, it absorbs issues in the world. And if you're not putting it adjacent to other people thinking about those issues, you're missing an enormous
right,
part of what architecture is. Um, and so James Bridle um, and all of his work and all of his thinking is something that architects should be aware of and should be thinking about and should be feeding into their ideas and their way of seeing the world, because it affects the way I see the world.
Right.
like
Right.
understanding how James sees the world, how Donna Haraway sees the world, how philosophers and thinkers are like identifying extremely important um, how would you say it, like currents, and drawing them out. And architecture is so far behind all those currents usually. And there are people like Liz Diller who are way more like, her mind and her thinking and her practice is always way ahead of what she builds, because, it's like 8 years
Right.
ahead,
Right.
just as a matter of fact. But, really, really, she's actually at that level of like someone who could, publish a book, thinking about the new dark age. Like she is equivalent to that. It's just that the
Mm.
work is the format is very
Mm.
different, and the time frame for that format is very different. So to me, including an
Right.
architect doing like temporary installations at Chicago Biennial, that's just a different format for their practice. But there are really, really many other ways that architecture can be expressed. And I think that calling a book like Radical Architecture of the Future is just saying, why do we always have to think about architecture as this finished product? It's clearly not. There are so many things that we have to understand about architecture that happen before anything ever gets built, and that design process is not a making process, and that design process is a thinking process, um, and that design process is a conversational process. It's a looking and listening process, and there are many, many, many practitioners in around us, like super exciting ways of taking all of those listening and thinking aspects of architecture and just coming out with a different output. And so for me, that's the thing that I look at, like what are they all thinking about, and then the output is the output. You know.
Yeah, I love that, and I think that, and if I haven't been clear, I like this approach to thinking about it.
Definitely, yeah. No, I
I'm
understand
totally
that.
in agreement with you. I have another question, kind of about this relationship between kind of the thinking or the questioning and the output. And I'm not totally sure how to phrase the question, so I apologize. I'm gonna read something that you wrote in the introduction that
Okay.
maybe can kind of get to my question. In the intro to the book, you say, when compiling this array of diverse projects, one thing that became clear is that the terms under which architecture exists today, permanent, patriarchal, capitalistic, upholding a Western canon, have changed. The biggest
Hmm.
civil rights movement of a generation, Black Lives Matter, which took place over the summer of 2020, has precipitated much needed reflection on the role of architects in manifesting an unjust social order of largely white male privilege, as well as the discipline's explicit contribution to the planet's ecological catastrophe. Um, I love that. I think that really sums up a lot of what this book is about. And I guess the question that I'm kind of trying to get to, or struggling to get out, is that the book is called Radical Architecture of the Future. We're already kind of interrogating this word architecture, but this idea of the future is also interesting because it's very much a book about the present also, and it's about taking these ideas and putting them into the world.
Hmm.
um, I don't know if that's a question, other than I would just love to hear you kind of talk about that. That that everything came back to formats and mediums and structures, that it isn't just, even the thinkers have things to show for it, you know what I mean, whether that is a book or a sculpture. What was that the idea of the object, I guess, maybe, is that something that's important to this? Do you know what I'm
I
trying to
think
say?
I think what you're getting at is that, sometimes when you think about architecture of the future, you think about hypotheticals, and you
Mm-hmm.
think about things that are like dream, archigram drawing projects, or you
Right,
think
right,
about, right, like
right.
there's something about imagining the future. But to me, I think it's more important to have finished projects that are the reference points and are are like potential directions. Like they're kind of lighthouses on the rocks of, like, you could come here. You could, if you're a young architect, you could also do this. Like, this is an amazing way to imagine the future of architecture. You don't have
Right.
to go the normal route. And in a way, the kind of idea of like radical architecture being something that's real and tangible, it's just on the fringes. And you can bring that into, the mainstream. Like everybody can go there, and then it will be less radical, and it will be normal, and that's fine too. I guess that's I think what's interesting
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
It's not a book that tries to imagine what the future is like. It's saying the future
Right.
is potentially like this if you follow and listen to the ideas of these very forward-thinking architects and these very important um, sort of kind of genre-defining practices. Yes, we could have a future that is a lot more equitable and is a lot more, it's a lot better on the environment. Like it has, these are real tangible projects that you could follow, and you may be radical if you're like the second one or the third one, but maybe if you're like the 25th one or the 100th one, it starts to become something that really matters to everybody. And I guess that's something that I like, and I always try to work with as a curator, is like real projects. I'm not someone who is particularly drawn to hypotheticals. I think that there is genuinely something quite remarkable about the building process and the making process, and I really respect and admire people that go through it and they are able to deliver something that matches, their vision in the beginning. It's not easy to be an architect. It's not easy to be an artist and get your vision manifested. It's extremely hard, and it takes um, I really respect people that are able to do that,
Yeah.
and I want to admire
Yeah.
that and say like this is not easy, and it takes like a real like mind of steel, to like get that done. And I
Hmm.
know that because I've been involved in many of these things. So I think that's why I'm always like, I really want to respect the makers and the people that deliver what they wanted.
I mean, do you see yourself as, again, thinking about these kind of expanded or blurry definitions, thinking about, kind of making or production? You did study architecture, even though you kind of knew that you weren't going to be designing buildings, it sounds like. Do you see your work as architectural in some way, or do you think that that education has shaped your work as a writer, curator?
I think so. Yeah, I definitely see myself as a designer of sorts.
Mhm,
Like I guess
mhm, mhm.
there is I have an eye but it's just that I design events and exhibitions, and
Right.
I my practice and my writing practice is something that um is, I would say, definitely architectural, architecture-ish. It's not,
Right.
it's not, um, it's obviously not architecture, but yeah, I do see myself as someone who, in the field. I don't think of myself as outside looking in. I do
Right.
kind of see myself as like part of this community.
I mean, yeah, it's interesting to kind of hear you say that, and I'd like to, maybe we're kind of moving through your career backwards in a way, because I think this totally connects to the world around.
Hmm.
Also, I mean, I think radical architecture of the future in many ways feels like a book form of what a lot of the people that you're kind of bringing together in the world around. And I think you could make the argument that the world around is about um, designing spaces in a way, not the physical spaces, but designing spaces for a particular type of conversation, which feels kind of architectural.
Definitely.
um, I, I guess just for people who are not familiar with the world around, can you give the kind of high level description about what that is? I have a couple specific questions, but just as to kind of frame that, how do you describe the world around?
So I call it I guess an itinerant organization because we don't have
Mhm.
a venue. So we're an itinerant nonprofit, and the idea is that we tell stories about contemporary architecture. And I really like this line of like making the invisible forces that shape our lives visible.
Mm,
And it's always one person, one project, one story, and the stories are related to a project that happened in the previous year. So it's a kind of archive of a kind of series of capsules of time of kind of architectural practice over
mm,
time. I guess much like this podcast in some ways, but like it's very much one project. So for
Right,
15
right,
minutes, one person presents one project, and it's a story of a building, or it's a story of a book, or it's a story of a movie. It's the story of a movement. It's a story of um, an installation, whatever it is. It's one story, and it's just a really great format to explore architecture, because it's a way of telling that kind of 50% or sometimes 60% of the presentation is going to be the making of and the thinking of, and then the last part is the kind of the real is the building itself, which is very much how I relate to architecture. So, and I love hearing from architects directly. I think it's just so much more of a dynamic way of presenting architecture than printed matter or even exhibitions. I think it's, to me, it's the way that I've best found to communicate what I love about architecture, and that's, I think it kind of comes through a little bit, in the kind of care and the attention that we pay to making all of these little films. And in the one that we just did, which was we're itinerant and currently we're in residence at the Guggenheim Museum. So we worked with them to create this all-day event in January, where we filmed a bunch of, like probably I think 20 different projects. We kind of went to people's studios, we went to the buildings themselves, we went to sites of research, we went to exhibition spaces, and we started to tell the story of all of these different projects that happened over the world. And I think the global component of it is extremely, as you will know, is very important to me. It's something that I really find important to show like extremely global perspective
right,
on contemporary
right.
architecture. So that's kind of what we do.
I totally get what you're saying about that format being kind of like the ideal format for you to talk about architecture in the way that and what you like about architecture, because that's how I feel about this podcast, in that there's something about the dialogue, the conversation, about kind of hearing from people actually talking about their work and how they think about their work, that starts to capture something, which is very much what you're doing. I think, obviously, like you said, the format is different and the structure is different, but I totally get why you're drawn to this. I would love to hear more about this 15-minute kind of talk, one project. When I first saw that was that when the World Around first launched, and this idea that it was 15 minutes, I immediately thought, and I apologize for saying this, I was like, oh, this is like TED Talky, it's superficial, it's think piece, like, that sort of thing. And it's really not. You're able to actually get quite a bit of depth in the 15 minutes. Can you talk about why that became the structure, and kind of how you move beyond this is star architect talking about star project?
I think well, as you may know, I was at the Met for 5 years as the curator
Hmm.
for architecture there, and um, one of the things that I was kind of able to do there was this conference called A Year of Architecture in a Day.
Right.
And that conference was really, I guess, the product of a lot of, discussions and, trying to figure out and create this kind of, or calibrate maybe the best way to kind of convey a year of architecture in a day. It was just an idea that I
Hmm.
had that I wanted to try. And the thing is about me is like I just don't. It's almost like I can't do less than a certain amount. Like I really want like a certain kind of number of people on a list. I don't know what it. I just want that diversity, that kind of global range, that spread. So it
Hmm.
started from that constraint of like, well, how do we tell a story of a year of architecture in a day? It's not going to work with like 6 people.
Right.
I'm going to need 25. And so
Right. Right.
it began with honestly that, and how do we, I just want David Adjaye to talk about the Smithsonian, I don't want him to do a 1 hour lecture,
Right, right.
because that's going to ruin my day. I need everyone to do 10 minutes. And so it started with 10 minutes. And it was kind of, it's such a different era, right? Of like flying people in to give a 10-minute presentation at the Met. I mean, it was, of course, and everybody, as you know, we don't really need to explain it, but of course, everybody came in for more than that and had, other reasons to come to New York. But ostensibly, we flew people from all around the world to come and give a 10-minute presentation, and they were broadcast on Dizine, and had a really big impact, because we were able to have this mix. Like Julie Moretu was speaking, Wolfgang Tillmans was speaking, but also like Ensemble was there, and Andres Hacker was there, and Go Hasakawa. And so we had like the same mixture of high profile and coming up, and everything was this kind of chemistry of like similar projects, but not very similar projects all at once. Um, and so the experiment kind of began with that, and that evolved, year on year, to become something that was kind of like impossible to manage by the end of it. Like the third edition of a year of architecture in a day had like queues around, the Met. Thousands of people showed up, and it was, yeah, it was impossible to manage, and it was a big success in that sense. But it was, uh, kind of outgrew the Met in a way, and so that was interesting. And I think that the way the world around emerged was like, how do we keep that going, but also just really dig into it and start to, create this archive and this educational resource, and be a real advocate for sharing knowledge about the absolute best practices in architecture today, and be a resource for students, be a resource for museum goers. It's not something that, and again, one thing that I really learned from the Met is that architecture is not, it's not just interesting to architects. And we were able to create this format that makes it digestible, that makes it interesting, that creates this, short story around a building that makes it really compelling. And like we, met trustees and met kind of just, people off the street were really into it, and that was so gratifying, honestly, because
Yeah,
that's kind
yeah,
of what you want.
yeah.
Um, and that's really where like both the book and the world around, that's kind of the genesis of both of those projects, really.
Can you talk more about the audience for the world around? I'm curious. I imagine that comparing to the Met, the world around, I could be wrong, but maybe has a different audience. But who do you see as the audience for the world around, and has that changed with things going remote, and that now these can all just be on YouTube?
Yeah, one of my big goals is to try and globally diversify the audience. I think that the actual people attending are pretty, not architecture specifically. It's like around 50% architects. Um, but I would like to have translations on all the videos pretty soon. So we'll have like, Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, Japanese. That's really important to me, and I think that's the next level for the world around to go into. And I think we did it a little bit with this last conference, where we had people speaking. We had Nishizawa speaking in Japanese, and we had I think only one other native language, which was in Spanish and in Mayan. But that's something I think that we can really lean into in the future and make the most of, being on YouTube and being online. And I think that's basically where I want to go next.
Kind of building off of that, do you see the narrative of the world around, or the kind of editorial framework or curatorial framework of the world around, do you see that as somehow countering a kind of dominant architecture narrative, or supplementing that? Or I guess the question is, I'm kind of curious how you see the world around fitting into a larger landscape of architecture discourse, and what you want the world around to do that only the world around could do. You know what I mean?
Mhm. I mean, I'm taking answers on that honestly, because it's kind of just over a year old. It's not very. I think that the 2x4 graphic design is so like iconic to me at this point. Like I feel like
Yeah,
people were asking me how many years the world around's, you know, and I was like, it's 1 year. Like we've done
yeah,
two
yeah.
events. So we're
That's so
still
funny too,
figuring it out.
because Michael has written and talked about how design actualizes things. It makes
Absolutely.
them real. And so their branding for you has and for many people has made the world around seem uh you know bigger, older, just because
Absolutely.
of having a good branding system. That's so funny.
Yeah, I mean, you of all people will know all about that, and
Yeah.
it works. And I think it's something that I was extremely, aware of. And Diego Marroquin, who I started the world around with, is completely on the same page and was like, if we're doing this, we're going to do this, and we're going to get 2x4, and it's going to look like a real institution off the bat. We're not
Yeah.
having. That's the way that we're going to do it. And I think that was such a great decision, and it's just been such a productive professional partnership with 2x4. I just love working with them, and they've done so much for us. Yeah, just through that um, extremely incisive identity building, brand building.
It's interesting to hear you say that, and I'm curious. You mentioned a little bit your time at the Met, and I'd like to kind of maybe compare the two because your career. Tell me if this is wrong, but it seems like your career has mostly been independent, but you have had these kind of brief moments where you've been inside institutions, whether that's like writing for Icon, which I guess is a much smaller institution than the Met, but then your time at the Met. Is there Can you talk about the differences between kind of working inside an institution versus starting something on your own, or working independently, and how you see both of those?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I wonder if I'm going to answer this in the right way, but there's some people who kind of put on like a uniform when they go to work, and that's kind of who they are at the office, and then there's someone else when they kind of go home. And I'm just not like that. Like, it's just kind of always me. And I think that that has been to my advantage in many places. Like, for example, when I've been independent, I've always been extremely like like another institution in London called the Gopher Hole with some friends of mine, and we decided to make our own institution, and we did a bunch of crazy programming and invited people all the time and had a lot of fun doing that. And then I was working in the Biennale, and I was in charge of the Biennale, and so I was like the same person starting an institution is suddenly responsible as a chief curator for managing 70 tiny different projects. And I think that this my interest is also is in being adapting, and I think that's a way of thinking about what I do. But I was kind of running a Biennale inside the Met, when I was doing the year of architecture in a day, and I was writing articles while I was still at the Met and traveling, and I think I was able to I learned so much from being at the museum, but I was also like really doing what I loved. So I was doing, commissions on the rooftop, worked with Amelia Parker, commissioning site-specific projects and managing production is something I'm really good at, and something I've done in many biennales and exhibitions I've done in the past. So it was really like a joy to be working on just a totally different scale. And like, okay, I've done exhibitions and biennales where the entire budget for the biennale is something like less than six figures. So and then working at the Met, and you have like a real budget, like you can do real projects. And so I was just able to kind of polish everything and professionalize everything that I was doing in a very scrappy way before. And so I think that that's in a way what happened. It's like I was just very productive and very busy, and I did biennale after biennale after biennale, and then I did you know performances and projects and writings and texts. But I kind of didn't stop doing those things in New York. It's just that I did them all within the museum. So I was sort of collaborating with the education department and the graphic and the design department, and I was working on the Breuer launch, and I was working on photography and acquisitions. And so I think the spinning plates, side of me just kept going inside the museum. And now that I'm out, it's the same thing. It's not didn't change that much. It's just, yeah, it got a little bit more professional. We have, I understand things a little bit, a little bit more. I'm building the 501c3. I'm working on board building and accounting and all of that stuff that you need to do. And so I think this, yeah, it's to me, it's kind of all the same.
Yeah.
Just
Huh.
It hasn't really changed me.
Yeah. I don't know if that's good or bad. I mean, I was asking that question somewhat selfishly as somebody who has also always been primarily independent and has definitely had moments where it's like, oh, this would be so much easier if I was just, inside an institution doing these things. But it sounds like it's just the same amount of work, and you're
Yeah.
just always doing everything if you're that kind of person.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the first interview I had with the Met, or one of the last ones I had with them. They were like looking at my CV, like, you seem to be really doing a lot. Like, why do you want to be at the Met? And I was like, I heard that you pay every 2 weeks.
Right,
This is
exactly.
great. Like,
Yeah,
so that was it was really it was a really wonderful experience, and I learned so much, and I met people who will be with me for the rest of my life in one way or another, and that's so meaningful. And some of my friends apply for jobs in institutions, and they're like, oh, am I gonna get a layer of dust over me, and sort of calcify somewhere. And I was like, I don't think so. I think it's great.
right.
I think that you have to get I feel like I got the maximum out of the Met that I could possibly have got. And if I'd stayed there for 10 years, it would have been kind of the same.
Right, right.
So that's how I see it.
What about? I'm not asking you to, trash talk the Met or anything like that, but I'm curious about the kind of I don't know the word, the flexibility or the openness to content and exhibitions. I mean, this goes back to what we were saying at the beginning, where I feel like radical architecture of the future and the world around are really pushing the limits of what we call architecture and what we
Yeah.
call architecture discourse. And I'm curious if, in being in an institution that has kind of cultural and institutional responsibility to, be a certain number of things, and then you being in the architecture department in there, were you still able to kind of push those boundaries and blur those definitions of architecture in an institution like that?
Well, I mean, I was in an art department. I mean, I was in the
Mm,
modern and contemporary art department.
mm,
So I actually was myself like expanding the definition of the art department by being an architecture
okay.
curator, if you see what I mean. Like, it was
Right.
almost the
Yeah.
opposite.
Yeah.
That they saw architecture as an expansion of the modern and contemporary field of art, which it is. So I think that gave me so much like I guess I was able to work with artists. So as a curator, I was working on the Rooftop Commission,
Right.
um,
Right.
and I was working on public programming, which really curators are not really supposed to do in institutions. You're supposed to work on shows and acquisitions, and then I was acquiring film. I was acquiring
Right.
art
Right.
films. I was acquiring photography. So it really was actually very much a big part of my engagement in contemporary art happened because of the Met. It definitely wasn't resisting that. by any means,
Mm.
you know. Um,
Yeah.
and that's not being political. It's just kind of true. And I think
Yeah.
that,
No, that's good to hear.
yeah, I think that the what I, really what I was interested in at the Met was how architecture was existing in the Museum of
Yeah.
Art, and I think that architecture was present in the Egyptian department. I saw it in my essay. Like there was architecture on display in maquettes in ancient Egypt, and there was architecture on display in wall posts in the African art department. There was architecture in period rooms, and it's just a place that is full and so kind of packed with different stories about architecture. So it was really generative, I think, in that sense. Like it totally kind of blew my mind about how we could think about architecture and how we can display architecture and the issues and constraints around it too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that was kind of what my question was, or what I was struggling to articulate a little bit, because architecture and design generally, to me, sometimes feels like when you put it in a department, when you put the boundaries around it, that is a disservice. It doesn't talk about the real lived experience of these objects or buildings or
Hmm.
posters or whatever they need to kind of be in this context. They need to be, um, you know, occupied, not just looked at,
Exactly.
and they live inside all of these other kind of departments in a way, and that's where they start to take on life, I guess.
Yeah. Exactly.
I have a couple questions to wrap up
Hmm.
the conversation, because I want to go back to the beginning of your career. You mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that you had an interest in being a writing about music. You always had an interest in writing. Your career started as a writer for Icon magazine.
Hmm.
Um, I'm interested in the differences and similarities for you between writing and curating. That move seemed to happen fairly quickly
Hmm.
for you. Do you see those as similar processes?
I think like editing, and I think that the I was the architecture editor at Icon, and I was they're pretty much straight out of architecture school.
Mm,
Um, I had done a master. I was kind of doing my masters of history of architecture at the same time I was at Icon, and I definitely saw the role of architecture editor as a very curatorial role. It definitely was. A bunch of stuff was coming across our desk, but I was actively. It was like, I don't know if you remember this time before the zine. Um, it was like, we needed to contact photographers and we needed to contact architects and find out what they're building and when it was finished, and get it shot and write about it and send someone to go visit it. And it was really exciting. It was really like it wasn't a process of like, just receiving press releases. It was really,
right,
it was
right.
very much, yeah, it was exciting. So I was involved in that. I would be on the phone to Iwan Barn or, whoever it was, the photographer, and just be like, what's your plan for the next couple of weeks? Like, where are you going? What are you shooting? Or can you go and do this? And so it was a very active role. Wasn't just writing,
Mm,
was making the magazine. And I think that we all saw, and I was working with Justin McGurk, um,
yep.
and we definitely saw the magazine as not something that was like an archive of what just happened, but like a manifesto of like, the best, and like, maybe we would be like creating this kind of the, the type of the type of work that we were showing. We kind of felt like um, it was important. Like I remember doing this issue called Activist Architects and thinking this was
Mm,
really important. It's really important work that we're doing. We did an issue about young architects. I would always do these young architect issues, and we felt it changed the careers of the architects being in the magazine. We felt like it was a certain influence that we had at that time. So it wasn't that difficult to go from that to curating. Also because of my background as an architect, trained as an architect, I moved to China in 2009. Just kind of arrived in Beijing with my work permit, and was like, okay, let's be a curator now. I wonder what that means. And there's a certain naivete that you kind of need to sort of accept that job, um, and a certain kind of innocence in a way, just to say yes to these projects that you clearly have no experience doing. And I would give so much credit to Oning, who was my boss, who hired me at 26 and just said, go, you can do this.
Yeah.
And I commissioned like 15 site-specific projects by architects, um, having never done anything like that in my life.
Right. Right.
So, um, yeah, it wasn't that much of a leap, and I worked with people I'd worked with before in the magazine, and so it felt quite natural. And a lot of people in London did that. They moved from magazine to museum, magazine to biennale. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, Justin McGurk is exactly the same.
yeah.
I mean, I asked that question selfishly as somebody who does a lot of writing and editing and is very interested in curating, and sometimes thinks about my work curatorially or curatorial adjacent.
Mhm.
And I've talked to many people on the show who are writers or editors who have moved into curating, and the thing that I'm kind of always asking them is like, I know how to make an argument in an essay, but then to do that with objects or in a space, I don't know how to do that. And that's something that I'm interested in. And so maybe my kind of follow-up question to you is where writing fits into your practice now.
Mhm.
Um, it seems you're still writing a lot. How does that kind of fit into all these other activities that you're doing?
Um, I think it's a it's a distilling process. I think writing for me, it's a just a gathering up of all of the ideas that are kind of floating around in my head, and it's an opportunity to
Mm,
um, just slightly more calmly process them. So I do see it as a kind of, it's not, I tend to write at the end of things, which I don't know is best, but I do, yeah, I kind of write, I don't know, I write in the evenings, I write late, I write into the night. I'm not like a early morning kind of writer. Um, and I think that, yeah, to me, it's just a sort of way of trying to make sense of what has happened. I rarely write in advance of a project. Yeah, it sort of happens, and then I have to think about it afterwards.
oh, that's interesting. I used to be a morning
You did?
writer. And I think some of that was just the like romantic notion that you're supposed to like get up early and write with like a clear head.
Hmm.
And I realized that I would always get distracted in the morning. I feel like, oh, there's other things I need to do today. There's like immediate tasks. And I found that I'm actually better writing at the end of the day after all the email has been answered, after
Yeah,
the like I
definitely.
actually need to get that stuff out of the way instead of doing the writing first, which has been
Same.
a weird shift that I had no idea was why I was struggling every morning.
Yeah, I can't write in the morning. It's impossible for me. I can't do
Yeah, yeah. It turns out me too. I had no idea. Um, I'm I want to know what's next for you. Obviously, you're building the world around.
it.
What are you thinking about right now? What are the issues that you are interested in? What's next for the world around? What's kind of like what's on your horizon?
I'm I teach at Pratt now. I have a seminar. So that's kind of new and nice. I'm really like truly I am trying to build the world around. Like I want to focus a lot on that, and it's I think that there are kind of a few different directions that we can go in. I think that there was such a lot of support from this edition. I think that
Hmm.
there was a sense of like this is the way to go. This is a really great, it works great for the architects. It works. It's a really nice exchange where it's not that the architects have to fly somewhere and present somewhere, and it's a kind of a one-way street in terms of like we just get them to perform on stage and then give them a dinner. Like we are really crafting a story with
Yeah.
them and telling their story with them, and we're producing a film that they can use too. And I really want to see where that goes. And
Mm-hmm.
I love I really enjoyed the process of making these films, and I work with this amazing producer and filmmakers, and they I think that we're going to try and think about exploring different avenues for the world around, like
Mm,
different roads that we could go down in the post-COVID world. But I do. I am kind of knuckling down into that, and that's. I'm kind of open to like ideas. What are we going to do? It's a lot of work to start an institution from scratch, to be honest. And we're at that stage of I'm at that stage of trying to figure out what's next and the right next move. But yeah, it's a lot of that, and I think that this year will be the world around, and then we'll see how next year goes. I mean, this year we're working with the Guggenheim, so there are 2 more events that we'll do with the Guggenheim this year. We'll have we'll do something in Venice, likely with Peggy Guggenheim, and we'll do another event in the fall in New York. So that's what I'm working on.
Nice. Yeah. Nice. My last question, this is a question I end all of these conversations with. I would love to know what you're reading right now.
I mean, let's put it this way. I just finished the whole 3-Body Problem trilogy.
I've not gotten to that yet.
So that was like a big, I was really like focused on finishing that. And now I just started Octavia Butler, The Parable of the Sower. So I'm kind of going through the sci-fi phase.
That makes sense. That does not surprise me at all. I mean, it comes back to Radical Architecture of the Future, which had so many kind of sci-fi. The book was not sci-fi, but it had sci-fi adjacent projects, I think.
Yeah, I'm kind of going through that, and I actually, I love reading. I really try to read as much as I can, and I think that I love sci-fi for that reason. It's just to me, books are the perfect format for sci-fi. That's where I think there is the imagination. I don't know how vividly and how creatively people can convey these worlds through writing is, to me, just a constant wonder. And yeah, I loved reading The 3-Body Problem, because every time I put the book down, I would look at my boyfriend and be like, "You're not going to believe what just happened."
Wow.
Just like so many ideas, like packed into, so many architectural ideas, so many spatial ideas, social ideas, they're just packed in there. And that's the genre of sci-fi. It's just like one crazy idea after the next. So I love it.
This was such a great conversation. Like I said at the beginning, I'm a big fan of you and your work, and it was so nice to talk to you about all of it and how you think about it. Thanks for being on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
This episode was recorded on February 18th, 2021. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.